Hello. Oh, here I am. Hello, everyone. Today we are going to meet with Jessie Stanier. I don't know, my pronunciation is always terrible. To talk about aging and making sense of aging. I look forward to this presentation. I think it's a very important topic to discuss in bioethics and to reflect on in our life. The floor, Jessie, is all yours. Feel free to ask questions through the chat or to our guest speaker. Thanks, Jessie, to be with us today.
Thanks, Susie. Yeah, it's really lovely to join all of you, and thank you for waking up in the morning to join in the webinar. I did a presentation on this course. I don't know if you're the same set of students, but back in March, I believe. So before the whole, the whole of academia was online. And yeah, it felt like a very different time. So maybe I've met some of you before virtually. I'm not sure. If you do have questions throughout, because the talk is probably going to meander a little bit, I'm not sure how familiar you are with ideas around aging and older age, so I'm just going to do bits of introductory stuff. If you have any questions, if you pop them in the chat perhaps, and I'll try and answer them as we go through, and then I think we'll have lots of time for discussion, which is the bit that I really enjoyed last time. So I think that's the plan. So I'll just bring up my slides. If you bear with me. Oh, am I still sharing the screen, Susie? Maybe not. Oh, here we go. Can you see my slides now? Yes, wonderful. Okay, so yeah, I can start by introducing myself. So my name is Jessie Stanier, and I'm a PhD student at the Wellcome Centre for Cultures and Environments of Health, and we're based at the University of Exeter in the UK. And this presentation is based on some of my PhD research, which is all sort of work in progress. But in my research, I use my background in philosophy and phenomenology to try and ask questions about how existential relations, so between people and time and the lived body and the world, how all of that comes together to influence how we make sense of our own aging from a first person perspective. So rather than studying aging and older age as something physical or biological that happens to people, I want to ask how our ideas and understanding of aging can actually shape how aging manifests and feels, especially in later life. So this approach leads to many complex questions, like how do we learn what's possible to do as an older person, and what political values are at play when we try and imagine those things? Why do we recognize certain physical experiences as related to health or age? We might experience a health condition when we're much younger and just think we're going to recover, or there's different kinds of perceptions that come into play there when age is kind of presented as more important to us, either by our own preconceptions or by medical practitioners or other people that we know. How is empathy possible between younger and older people so that we can learn and care across generational experiences? Perhaps these are all questions you've asked yourselves before, or perhaps you're wondering how this fits into a course on bioethics and phenomenology, which would be more than fair enough. So you might have noticed that the current pandemic has revealed an underlying kind of callousness, I suppose, to people who have an underlying health condition, people who are more at risk, and older people are kind of part of that group. Discussion of the pandemic has shown, a lot of negative attitudes towards people who are more vulnerable, whether that is, as I say, sort of people with long-term health conditions, people of color. We look at the mortality rates, and there are issues there as well. And one of the things that has come out of this is the boomer remover hashtag. You may or may not have seen this online and seen it in the reporting. Some people will make the case to say that this is a bit of a joke, but it certainly plays into very serious ageist attitudes that are really pervasive in our society. And it's certainly been coupled with the idea that older people, it's acceptable for them to be expendable. Commentators have made light of the mortality rates. It's been suggested that older people should be deprioritized for treatment if health services are overwhelmed. And it's also been suggested that their loss would somehow benefit the economy. So that's quite serious. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that the distribution of health and social care is an easy problem to solve, or that there aren't especially difficult bioethical challenges that arise in public health crises. It's really hard to get this right. It's happening in real time. It was a challenging situation before, and the COVID-19 pandemic has only made that even more acute. I do think, however, that we need to be really seriously asking ourselves whose lives are seen as valuable right now. Why is that? How are we making sense of vulnerability across the life course? And why are people being shamed for being more vulnerable? And how misconceptions about older age are affecting lived possibilities for all sorts of people. When it comes to social distancing, for example, a lot of the advice is based around chronological age, and that's having an effect on families and who can see one another, and all kinds of relationships with people at all different kinds of ages. Not to mention the fact that if we're lucky, all of us are going to get older at some point. So these are things that we need to be thinking about. One of the few philosophers to engage with the problem of aging was the existentialist philosopher Simone de Beauvoir. And she said, and I'm quoting now, aging takes on a great many different aspects, no one of them being a function of the others. Any statement that claims to deal with old age as a whole must be challenged, end quote. So today's presentation is titled Making Sense of Aging and Finding Its Time. And as well as getting you thinking about aging and older age, which I'm not sure whether you've done before in a sort of academic sense, I'd like to show you why I think that we can think about aging in some different ways to some of the existing perspectives. There's quite a heavy emphasis on narrative within something called critical gerontology. And in the same way that you have, critical race studies, critical disability studies, there's a critical field for the study of aging. So I thought we'd start by working through some of the widely used theoretical concepts of aging to give you a lay of the land, and then we'll see how people often try and make sense of aging in narrative notions of identity through the different stories people tell about themselves over their lives. And we can spend a bit of time exploring why narrative is important and how it can shape senses of possibility in our lives, and how this often reflects and refracts broader social structures, even when we're thinking about really personal details. But finally, we can think about the elements of experiences that doesn't come into narrative, and perhaps it's really difficult to incorporate into narrative, particularly in later life. So how we can try and make sense of all those things, why it's important. So that's kind of where we're heading. Like I said, this is going to meander a little bit because I'd like to touch on some different things and introduce a few different things to you. So if you have a question, you want something clarified, pop something in the chat, and I'll try and answer that while I'm talking. Cool. So I'll start with a brief overview of concepts of aging from broader academic perspectives. So by doing so, I think we can tease apart some different layers to the way that we think about the idea of age and aging. So becoming sense in a colloquial sense, becoming old, in a colloquial sense, it means having lived for a long time. The young at the beginning of their lives, whereas older people have been at it a while. But beyond this, there are various ways to conceive of time with respect to aging, the time through which we live as we age. And for a long time, dominant Western ideas about aging have made decline in older age seem natural and inevitable. Chronological age has been seen as pointing inevitably in a kind of very straightforward linear sense towards disengagement with public participation, health difficulties, and death. It's seen as a kind of one-way street. And that problematic perspective also saw physical disability and social isolation in later life as just invariable givens across history and also across culture. And we know that, you know, there are lots of different ways of receiving elders across the world and across, you know, our history. So much research and many other perspectives have countered this view, as you might imagine. Gerontology, the study of older age, emerged as a medical and social discipline in the mid-20th century. Western health practitioners began to embrace the notion that preventative treatment could result in longer and healthier life for older people. So lifelong diet and exercise, particularly the maintenance of muscle mass, they do have long-term health benefits and can help older people keep engaged and active, among others. So the emphasis sort of changed, rather than aging being something that would be inevitably bad. It sort of got reconceived as like a condition to be cured, a bit like a pathology or an illness or something. You know, in crude terms, if only the science was right, we would be young forever. And this led to various discourses on successful aging. And there's loads of different versions of this. There's active aging, productive aging, positive aging, optimal aging, effective aging, independent aging, and healthy aging. And that all sounds great, right? You know, there's this famous sort of definition of what successful aging would be from Rowan Kahn. They say, so it's low probability of disease and disease-related disability, high cognitive and physical functional capacity, and active engagement with life. I think most of us would hope to have some sense of that when we reach older age, and we want that for anyone else. And these goals for older people, you know, they're supposed to improve quality of life, and they've definitely helped geriatric medical practitioners to support older people in their individual aging processes. The problem is successful aging often sort of talks in terms that say you've been successful if you manage to stay economically productive. And some people are better able to do that than others. So it's much easier for a white middle class person to attain successful aging with their privileged access to health and well-being resources. They've often led less physically grueling careers, so there are fewer long-term health conditions to contend with anyway. And their retirement is a time of relative freedom. But of course, you know, class and race both play huge roles in health inequalities throughout the life course, but that particularly bears out in older age, and you can see it in life expectancies, both in terms of you know, how long people live altogether, but also how long people can expect to live healthy lives, you know, lives where they can meet this definition of successful aging. It's not simply something that people are personally responsible for. So these successful aging initiatives, which are, you know, often based in perfectly decent science in the abstract, tell people to keep the same kind of adult life they've always had without becoming vulnerable or needy, and without also investing in public health and social care. So that's a bit of a difficult conundrum. So yeah, by conceiving of aging as a condition to be cured, older people tend to get put into one or two of these distinct stages. You might have heard of the third age and the fourth age, perhaps not. In the UK, we've got something called University of the Third Age, which is like this group for older people who want to carry on learning and stuff. So it's kind of in the public language a little bit, but it originates from a gerontologist who kind of came up with this distinction between the third age and the fourth age. So the third age is regarded as a time for health and personal fulfillment for older people, when you might see successful aging as being upheld. And the fourth age is regarded as a time of dependency and decline and eventually death. So in other words, that's when it's too late for successful aging. And obviously there's a bit of a double standard here. Living a long life will inevitably involve some degree of frailty in the final years. It's not something many of us want to think about, but many mainstream welfare practices and policy frameworks will categorize older people within this binary of independence or dependence, of living or dying, without really recognizing that older people themselves have to try and make sense of these uncertain experiences of, you know, feeling vitality and engagement, but also some finitude and some change in their life as well. And the academic approaches kind of reinforce these binaries as well. So supporting either sort of ageless activity or effectively providing like palliative care with a view to people dying. So there's not much space for this kind of different stage of life where you know you're not necessarily talking about the end, but you might need a bit more assistance. And there's an emphasis on attending to the aging body without speaking and working with older people and their personal values and priorities. And of course, you know, aging is sort of an identity that we start to talk about later, but we have an age identity all the time, and that intersects with all manner of other things like gender and race and class, perhaps also disability, and that some people have disability at other times during the life course, and that's going to manifest in different kinds of priorities and values. You know, not older people aren't all the same. They don't suddenly all group together and feel like they're all kind of in one group. And that kind of gets missed out from a lot of these approaches to care and welfare. So how does that affect what it feels like to be getting old? Well, understandably, there's a lot of stigma and shame around the accrual of health conditions in older age, especially when they're visible to others who associate it with aging. Older people tend to actively work against visible markers that suggest limitation, finitude, or social loss. And many report a clear distinction between being old as something that they just are in relation to others, and feeling old in relation to specific episodes or events that happen to them. So that feeling old is kind of associated with when their personal values or sense of individual self are threatened. And then that's interpreted as being related to their age, whereas the rest of the time it would have been put down to something else. So it's kind of interesting to see that that's the way that a lot of older people are bringing the concept of age to bear on their experiences. You know, because we're all facing this dilemma of wanting to live a long time and not wanting to grow old. So that manifests in all sorts of kind of contradictions and tensions when we're trying to make sense of aging, we're trying to make sense of our experience. Yeah, so it's a well-intended idea, the successful aging, but it runs us into some difficulties, and we're certainly not the first to notice. Just in the same way there are critical movements in other fields, like I said, we've got critical race studies, disability studies, gender studies. There's critical age studies, and it's been about for quite a long time. And it asks where our medical and social conceptions of aging come from and how they bear out. And someone called Margaret Morgenroth-Goulet, which is quite it's a great name, I think. Anyway, she suggests that critical age theory might better help people understand the personal significance and degree of decline that they're experiencing in age. So that's kind of thinking about what are the perceived limitations and norms and experiences and possibilities that we have in later life. She wants us to understand that it is not simply the biological body that ages, but that cultural norms in which we live produce certain kinds of aging bodies. And also it matters how this is all experienced and interpreted by people of all different ages. There are certainly, you know, some irreparable, inevitable, irreversible changes in health when we get older, and those are all different for different people depending on the lives that they've led. However, the significance of those changes can be coloured by an ageist society and can fuel a sense of defeatism in older people that can become self-fulfilling. So rather than finding ways to adapt to life anew and being encouraged to kind of find, well, the words new normal have obviously taken on a different significance recently, but you know, finding a new normal in your own life is something we have to do all the time, whether it's when we're kind of aging as teenagers into adulthood, midlife, but also maybe particularly in later life. And those ageist assumptions can avoid people of kind of confronting what those changes might mean for them because they just seem too awful or too socially stigmatized. So yeah, Goulet contends that, you know, we can imagine a great deal more freedom and pleasure and what she calls narrative control in having what she calls an age identity. And that age identity for her would consist in like a life story or a tale that we tell ourselves, like an autobiography. She says, and this is on the slide, we need to wake up every day securely still me, Once we have consciously added lifetime to our sense of being, we can call the accumulated comprehensive self each of us wake up with our age identity. So we've got here a narrative notion of the self, which is kind of the way that some critical gerontologists are thinking about aging. It's the idea that, you know, we can imagine different possible stories and tell our own narratives differently. And then we might not experience the same degree of stigma, shame, and limitation in later life. So what do we mean? What do we mean by narrative? Well, narrative involves recalling experiences and putting them into words, into a story for the self and to others. So one famous philosopher who wrote about narrative is called Ricoeur, and he said, narrativity is the mode of discourse through which the mode of being, which we call temporality or temporal being, is brought to language. Many of us know and love older people who delight in telling stories from their past. And there's this urge to recall past life and construct a narrative identity and, you know, sometimes conjure up maybe a nostalgic familiarity and make present what is remembered, rightly or wrongly, of better times, or simply things that, you know, just have come to pass, and to pass those experiences on. Can also provide a means for individuals to accept those kinds of changes in their identity as they adapt to life in old age. And we've got a quote here from Simone de Beauvoir again, and she says, "Old age is more apparent to others than to the subject himself. It is a new state of biological equilibrium, and if the aging individual adapts to it smoothly, he does not notice the change." So perhaps some of this stuff that goes into narrative, it has to be thrown back at us in order for us to be able to think about it. So, you know, all of us are getting older all of the time, and we don't spend most of our time thinking about it. You know, we don't wake up the next day and go, right, I'm one day older, what does that mean? Perhaps only on our birthdays. But perhaps there are certain kinds of experiences that throw us back and kind of ask us to think about what that might mean for us, think about our age identity. And Beauvoir draws our attention to the way that age, it does present itself in these kind of interruptions and comparisons, rather than we're immersed in day-to-day sort of seamless, ageless living. Old age, it sort of presents itself as like something other to this otherwise normal life. And these are sort of surprises that come from others, the realization of how we're being seen. So maybe it's the first time you get offered a seat on the bus, being referred to as the old man, or being asked to retire. How does that become part of age identity? Well, you know, as we discussed earlier, many older people resist incorporating these into narrative identity. You know, these are difficulties that are compounded by an ageist society where the word old has pejorative overtones. You know, it's not something that you want to be called. And these experiences would be difficult to come to terms with under any circumstances. You know, even if we didn't have those kinds of ageist norms, it's a difficult thing to come to terms with. You know, the body might be experienced as somehow other. You know, if you have a fall as an older person, or one day you start trying to figure out if the toilets are nearby, and that becomes important, or one day struggling to get up from your chair. You know, these are gradual changes in health that they come from aging in some way, and that there's a sort of temporal change. This is something that becomes more normal, and they garner significance through the life world, through you know, the kind of environment that you're living in. And as we discussed earlier, you know, that's going to change, that's going to depend on the kind of person you are and the kinds of political context that you're living in an intersectional sense. You know, Beauvoir also says we must assume a reality that is certainly ourselves, although it reaches us from the outside and although we cannot grasp it. So, you know, what I really want to ask and ask you as well is kind of, why is this reality so difficult to grasp? What's going on when we try to put our experiences into a narrative? And is there something about older age and later life that is distinctively challenging? How is it possible, you know, going back to the title of the presentation, to make sense of aging and find its time? I think a lot of this comes back to a fairly fundamental question, a philosophical question about selfhood. So it's bound up with notions of personhood and ego and identity and character. selfhood, it brings together these notions of continuity and difference. So you've got each sort of iteration of the self, or each moment of the self is given by experiences prior. And in that sense, the I that we talk about in a narrative can identify with its previous self. There's a sense of continuity there, but it's not the same. Time has passed. And this relation might be described as auto-affective. So the Greek root of the word auto refers to the self and sameness. And the word affection can be understood as having an effect on, making a difference to, using, or assuming, if you want to kind of break down the word. So auto-affection altogether refers to self-experience, bringing together both the affected and the affecting. So the narrative I kind of represents the self reflecting on its own auto-affective structure of experience. So there's this kind of thinking about itself that happens when we talk about narrative and we start using the word I. What am I? Who am I? But introspection alone can't tell us all that we are. So self-description, it kind of always fails in some way because we're mediated through a prism of social practices. We don't get to choose how we're received by others and how we're addressed by others. We don't get to choose all of the options available to make ourselves socially intelligible. So if we want to give an answer to the question, who am I? And not to get a completely vacant stare, there are certain kind of options available to us that we sort of understand just as being part of a culture. And that much is clear from a lot of the work of feminist and critical race scholars, as well as disabled and queer activists. So much of experience, there is so much of experience that we don't have words for, either because we don't yet understand that of ourselves, or we have to work to communicate with others and make space for ourselves. Judith Butler says, to say, as some do, that the self must be narrated, that only the narrated self can be intelligible and survive, is to say we cannot survive without an unconscious. So, horizons of possibility for action and narration lie somewhere between the story that we can control and talk about, and this kind of broader political landscape which molds our experiences of ourselves before we've even had a chance to think about them. And so I think that goes for everyone, but if we bring it back to aging, the key difference, I think, when it comes to narrating age is we just think about old age as this kind of strange other thing that is different to normal life. I think it has a lot to do with the fact that we don't incorporate the idea of aging into our narratives, at least until we're sort of middle-aged. And it's associated with the end of life, despite the fact, for many older people, that's still a distant horizon. We spend many years of our lives as older people in comparison with younger people. And in an ageist society, that can diminish our openness to the future. It can encourage nostalgia for a life already lived, and it causes this sort of stagnation. And of course, that affects the way that other people think about, the way that we treat elders as something to be sort of kept separate because they're no longer productive and they've had their time. All of those sort of ageist assumptions are bound up in this sort of taboo that we have about thinking that we might be aging all the time. So it's much easier in many respects to regret the notion of being older until it's just simply not possible anymore, and lots of physical realities present themselves. We need to start thinking about health and social care, and that can make it really difficult for nurses and care workers to work with older people as well, because understandably they feel so resistant to that becoming part of their lives. Much like the rest of life, making sense of aging is kind of this simultaneously a conscious and unconscious struggle to be recognized under terms to which we identify. And aging, perhaps most clearly, evidences the fact that we change. So that can muddy the waters when we're trying to claim a sort of static identity to say, this is who I am. Because who we are might have been different from who we were, but also they sort of feel like they should be continuous. And that's a challenging thing to grapple with. And while it's important that aging is something that people feel able to incorporate into their narrative age identity, we also need to leave space for people to grow and change and age unconsciously in the meantime. So in later life, this often involves negotiating loss and grief, finding new social roles, health conditions, changed relationships, and changing times. That's a lot to contend with. So yeah, we've covered a lot today. What's the takeaway? I hope that we've introduced you to some ways that people have attempted to make sense of aging as a phenomenon. And I hope to have shown that far from being a simple biological process in the body, aging is very much affected and shaped by the society we live in. As the current pandemic has highlighted, it's really key that we think differently about vulnerability and interdependence and care, not least because we've been reminded of the precariousness of everybody's health. So rather than asking older people to take responsibility for successful aging or asking them simply to tell different stories about themselves, we can all undertake this painstaking collective project of imagining a different kind of later life, both for our elders today, but also for generations to come, and recognize that the intersectional and culturally specific ways that aging can play out, and it's important to give people space to age in different ways. Yeah, so rather than treating it as like a terrible homogenous fate that we're all going to end up reaching, we can listen to older people about their experiences and their priorities, because life exceeds any account we try to give of it in all its diversity and complexity at all ages. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for listening. I'd love to open up for discussion now if possible, and I really look forward to hearing about your perspectives, any experiences you might have had. Yeah, I'm going to close my screen share.
Thank you, Jessie. A virtual applause and a big thank you for your clear and very well informed presentation. You brought up sources that I think are very useful to start a fruitful conversation on the topic. Thank you. I don't know, I open the floor and if you have questions you want to ask to our excellent speaker, just type it in or open your mic and ask the question yourself, the way you prefer the most.
I think we've had a question on the chat. I could start
there
with that.
There are plenty of thank yous. Also, yeah, great. There's Mark.
Hi, Mark. Isn't the source of a lot of negative images of aging a reluctance to confront the fact of one's own mortality? Perhaps Heidegger has some bearing there. Yeah, I would totally agree. I think a lot of that comes from reluctance to confront our own mortality. I think it's interesting to look at what images or markers are seen as being significant in relation to mortality, as opposed to just sort of general change. So, for example, the whole notion of the midlife is actually quite a recent thing. It sort of happened in the sort of post-war years where people were sort of researching menopause. The notion of the midlife crisis became something as the sort of gaps between generations changed, where people would be looking after their older parents and also raising a family. And so there are sort of culturally specific markers that can point towards where you are in the life course, like how proximate is that mortality. For some of us, we don't have to think about it so much. And certainly there are things like, physical markers that fairly universally are seen as showing that you're older, like having wrinkled skin and grey hair and such. But I think it's, we're all going to die. But it's interesting to raise this kind of social question about, well, what are the pointers that say, well, you need to confront this question now, the sort of immediacy of it. Obviously, in much later life, that becomes much more pressing, and perhaps that's where the third age, fourth age thing has some merit, in that it certainly asks us to confront those questions more seriously towards the end. So I hope that helps. It's not really bringing Heidegger into it, but that's the sort of angle where I think there's some social contingency there.
That's interesting.
Oh, I can see you. Oh, hi.
Yeah, I'm here. The point about social contingency is interesting because, of course, in former ages, before medical science got to where it is, people lived with death a lot more than they do now. They had very high infant mortality, and everybody will have experienced death and bereavement, not just among their elder relatives. And so death was more present in people's lives, and I think they were more attuned to the fact of death than young people are today. And I think that's one of the reasons that, I mean, there's a terrible realization that comes upon you as you get older, which I know from experience, that there are fewer days ahead than there are behind you. And it's quite a frightening realization. I mean, I think I've been afraid of death since I was 8, but never mind. I think death has now become so remote in our society that people tend to not welcome anything that reminds that. But you see this. I'm a wheelchair user, and you see the same prejudice against disabled people, in that disabled people remind people of their frailty and of their ultimate, fate, shall we say. But thanks, Jessie, that was great.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thanks, Mark. I know that Javi Corral has done some work about phenomenology and illness, and in relation to Heidegger, and the kind of the way that it similarly, because it reminds people of mortality. But I think you're right. The point about normalization is really important. I think, you know, the anti-aging industries and the whole setup is to make sure people stay economically productive, don't contemplate the end of life and the necessary preparations that need to be made. And in other times in history, that was quite different, and we were confronted with it far more frequently. So yeah, I think that's really helpful. Thank you. I don't think we've had any more questions on the chat.
Yeah, it doesn't seem we have a new question. While we're waiting for more questions to come, I build up on Mark's question, and I ask you, what do you think about this problem being related to the almost complete lack of the philosophy of birth? I mean, so far, there wasn't any discussion. Now we start having a few, especially female philosophers, reflecting on what it means to be born. It wasn't that developed. And yeah, I have the feeling that death became even more scary and mysterious, and, you know, the existential anxiety about it grew because we didn't reflect enough on what birth is also. And then aging is this scary reminder of who knows what. What do you think about that?
That's really interesting. I have to talk to Nicole about it with all her research on pregnancy. Yeah, I think there's been some interesting feminist work by the likes of Adriana Cavarero and other people in that tradition who've kind of brought Hannah Arendt to bear on birth, and then also other points where we're vulnerable in the life course. So, you know, to bring someone to be born involves already a sociality, and also when someone dies, you know, unfortunately many people do die alone, but they die alone within a social context, a context that has allowed that to happen, in the same way that there are harmful social contexts into which one can be born. There are also harmful social contexts out of which one might die. And I think thinking about that, rather than it this kind of being this abstract thing like birth and death as these sort of very difficult to think about existential boundaries, you know, sociality is involved already in both of those things. So that's the way I would think about birth and death together. Yeah,
I agree. I agree. Who knows? I don't know. I feel a little bit polemic recently with the existential statement of, yeah, one of the certainties that we will die, we are alone, we will die alone. I think that taking away sociality from life, intersubjectivity, interaffectivity, the life world, all these concepts that come along, is quite harmful for our meaning-making process, which you very nicely emphasized in your presentation. Because it seems that at some point, okay, it's you are going to be alone in making meaning of your life. And it's really difficult to make meanings in complete isolation. It's almost artificial.
Absolutely, yeah. In a small way, I think a lot of people have experienced that in recent months in terms of isolation and discovering to what extent they were relying on all kinds of relationships and spaces and meetings with people and participation in activities to structure their sense of meaning. So in a small way, maybe we've all been reminded of that, but of course, towards the end of life when it's even more difficult to maybe engineer contact with others, that very lonely meaning making is difficult and lonely, as I say.
Adriana has a question.
How do people move past the fear of mortality?
That's all yours.
Oh, that's a hard question.
That's a big one.
I suppose it depends how pessimistic you want to be about well, I suppose it depends if you mean the mortality bit or the bit before. The vulnerability bit, I think, is more scary for some people than the actual sort of non-existence of death itself. And I think that's, to me anyway, that seems a lot more frightening, because that involves putting a hell of a lot of trust in the fact that you're going to be cared for and the fact that you're going to be supported. How to move past that? Well, the single biggest way to make sure you're going to be okay is be rich. And unfortunately, most people they can't just switch a button and sort themselves out like that at all. If you're wealthy, then you're probably going to be fine because you can pay people to look after you. For the rest of us, that's not a certainty, and so it's understandable to be quite afraid of that prospect. I'm not sure there's a lot to be done to move past it, to be honest, except cultivating a sense of, like, I know a lot of people who do better have long-term hobbies and things if once they have to move into a state of care, or maybe into a care home and things, being able to have a sense of continuity with past selves can be very can encourage people to feel more integrated as they reach their final years. And you don't even have to be able to bring an I or a narrative to that, like I was describing in my presentation. It might just be habit or body memory that allows you to kind of recognize things. And so maybe that would be a way of kind of helping people, if not move past the fear of mortality, at least ease those final years in some way by thinking about it before they come to reach us. We've got some more questions. I have always heard when you grow older, people tend to change drastically and change their personality. They say it's due to aging. How is it that people change so much as they age? Unfortunately, some of that might be to do with dementia and Alzheimer's and conditions like that, which have quite serious neurological effects on people's personality and inhibitions, and that's a very difficult experience. I'm sure some of you may know people who are going through that, both to witness in particular. I think people are might be surprised about how much is still continuous there, like that those people still have the same base of experiences, but their behavior has changed. So when you show older people with dementia familiar objects from their childhood, for example, there's still responses there that show they're sort of the same person. There's still very meaningful objects to them, even if they're not able to describe that. But yeah, people change. that's the sort of more kind of serious end of things. I think some other people just stop caring about what other people think, and that's the more joyful kind of change, personality change, that I think we might aspire to, is just, you know, not giving a crap anymore, to be blunt. And that could be quite liberating. I think that's what some of the critical age studies people are trying to discuss, is kind of this control what you can control, and live the life that you want to live. So there's different ways to take that question. I hope that was helpful in some way. Mark says, Heidegger argues that one has to be toward death to embrace death as part of life. Yes, quite agree. Elaine says, do you think aging impacts mental health? If so, is it more of a positive or negative impact? I think it really depends. You know, dementia is also counted as part of mental health, depending on who you talk to. People often think that loneliness is a distinctively, it's more of a problem for older people, and that's just simply not the case. People can be lonely across the life course, and when people are lonely, that exacerbates all kinds of other health conditions. I think that has a lot more to do with how well connected you are and how marginalized you are, and all of those kinds of things. Obviously, when you're older, it's quite possible that some of your friends will be passing. You know, family members may have moved away, and so there are factors that might contribute to loneliness. But if you're part of a connected community, then that might not be such a contributor to loneliness as such. I think mental health can affect anybody at any age. I think obviously there are some particularities like that are going to be difficult, especially when it comes to, say, losing your life partner, or having to go into a care home. You know, those are really difficult things that they might precipitate things like anxiety and depression and other things. But so do big other life events at other points in the life course. I think we all have to face those kinds of challenges to mental health at different stages. Maria says, it just amazes me how few of my family members were once very kind and their personality changed just an instant. Yeah, I think it can be really difficult to adapt to being older, maybe being more dependent, and that can bring some difficult behaviors to bear. You know, people, you know, I was talking about older people sort of resisting being called older, and maybe resisting even the care that they're receiving. People don't necessarily want to be infantilized or treated in a certain way, and even when it's coming out of a place of care, it might be being received that way. Obviously I can't speak to any of your experiences with your family members, but I think there are lots of reasons why older people might be a bit grouchy. They might be in pain. It's very complex, and it's difficult for, I think, for family members and friends and loved ones to navigate those things and to understand why, because it can be difficult to really understand why that's happening for yourself, let alone explain that calmly to someone else. Also, of what they go through so limited that their reactions seem not understandable to us. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think it's a really important time to be thinking about how we can empathize with others, not just, you know, older people, but also people with other experiences to ours. I think a lot of people have had extremely different experiences of lockdown, for example, and now that we're sort of at this stage of having to come back together again, it's really hard to sort of bridge that gap and explain what's happened. And, you know, for a lot of older people who've been locked in care homes, and the mortality rates in care homes have been extremely high, you know, and then you're able to see your loved ones again. How do you explain that? Or how, as a young person, do you explain what that's been like, say, if you haven't been able to go to college, or you haven't been able to see your friends for ages? The question of how we relate to others, how we understand others' behaviors is I think really as pressing as ever at the moment.
Thanks, Jessie. Yeah, I do agree. I mean, Seneca says, Seneca and Stoics say that we die every day. And it is true. I mean, every day we grow older. As you were saying before, we have marks in our life, the birthday or the first time they ask you to sit on a bus that reminds us, okay, I'm growing older. But this reorganization of meaning, this effort to feel empathy, this care you put in how you want to die, how you want to lose your energies, should be an effort that we make every day, because it happens every day. Oh, we have a new question. Sorry, let's move attention to new questions.
Sure. So I read it out. Let's see. Could we say that citizenship or residentship is a necessary condition for confronting aging? That is aging, in the sense of auto-affection, a right solely exclusive for people that are not immigrant? Of course, immigrants age in a medical sense, perhaps even faster, but is there a special narrative regarding aging of an immigrant that is different, not necessarily opposed to that of a citizen or resident, or are these coming to terms with aging mechanisms, same in the sense of nature? It's a really interesting question. I would not want to speak for sort of immigrant experience, but I would imagine, you know, the kind of security that one would experience in feeling that you will be cared for may be very different if you're away from somewhere that feels like home, depending on how much you feel supported by a community. And of course, that community can exist outside of the country where you were born. But those kinds of, I suppose, precarities that might exist, if there's a possibility that your right to live somewhere might be jeopardized, that you might be seen as other in more than one sense. You know, if you're seen as other because you're old, but you're being seen as other because you're an immigrant. I think those things probably coalesce in quite particular ways. So I think your suggestion in the question that there might be some difference there is really valid. Yeah, that's my sort of instinct to answering your question. I think that's a really important thing to attend to, and I know for a fact that there are social science studies out there that have kind of investigated these kinds of questions, speaking to elders in diaspora communities and things, and talking to them about what their experiences are, and yeah, there's certainly. Oh, can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay, there's something said my internet connection was bad. Yeah, yes. If you'd like to say a little bit more about what you think, then please do. It'd be really interesting to hear what you think, Saba. The question of citizenship is also kind of interesting, in terms of who is entitled to care, and that will depend on the kind of the health system in a given country as well. Whether the everybody is entitled to care, or whether you're likely to fall between cracks. That's a question of citizenship as well. So yes, lots of dimensions. So this is why the intersectional way of thinking through aging is really important, and that's been emphasized for a long time by feminist scholars of age studies as well, that we're not simply aging, we're aging as gendered and racialized and multiply abled and all of these other things, and certainly our immigration status plays a big part of that as well.
Yeah, citizenship is so crucial for many important rights. If you're not a citizen, you're not a person on so many levels. Sava is explaining herself.
Oh, let's have a look.
Themselves.
She says, I'll read it out just in case people can't see the chat. I do believe there is a difference given the fact that you lack something called a livable life. just came to my mind listening to your presentation. I have some background in migration studies, but I've never come upon aging discussion in this topic. Yeah, it's interesting. I think age does drop out as a category of analysis quite often. And I think because, you know, there's always this assumption that most people are active participants in public life. You know, even within kind of other critical studies, this sort of idea that there is this other stage to life which would be a bit different, even with all of these other kinds of identities and experiences, it just sort of bottoms out. It's like if there's some literature in migration studies to do with aging, I'm sure there would be, but it might be siphoned off into the age studies section of things rather than integrated into more mainstream literature. Just in my experience, that often seems to be the case. Thanks, Albert. It was a really, really interesting question and helpful response.
So we might have time for one last very quick question, if you have it. If you want to use the chat or the microphone. But yeah, thank you. You gave us lots of material to reflect on and to think about for our next, for our semester and in general for our life, because it's something that concerns all of us. And yeah, as Maria was saying, it allows also to live better with the people we have around us, because sometimes behaviors seem impossible to understand, and it's just that we don't have enough education on empathy, I would say, on how to connect with this kind of lived experience. So I'm very happy that you brought us this great presentation on this specific lived experience.
No, thank you, Susie, and thank you everyone for engaging and listening and getting up in the morning to think about a topic like this. You know, that's not easy. So well, yeah, it's been a pleasure.
Fits because today it's a little bit scary outside. There's no morning. Now it's 9. I don't know how it is in your home, kids, but here there's no light. It's still night in the Bay Area. It's quite scary. So it's the right time to reflect on the meanings of our life. Thank you so much, Jessie. This was precious. Thank you, all of you, for coming today. Thank you, Xerxes, for helping me in organizing these webinars every time. Is the one who puts forward, you know, the announcements and helped me to be on track. And thank you for all the guests who joined and brought up very interesting questions today. We have another webinar soon. I don't remember when, but there will be. And you are all welcome as usual. Thank you so much, everybody. Ciao.
Thank you.
Have a good
everyone.
day. Bye.
Thank you.
Ciao.